Chapter 2. Gwyn bit her lip and held her breath as the formidable mass of stones, easily spanning 30 feet high, approached with each gentle bump of her carriage. The night breeze toyed with the golden blonde curls of her hair, tossing them back as the steady wheels of her coach rolled ever forward. To say she was excited was an understatement. She was positively thrilled. For the first time in 3 years, she was visiting Arvendone Castle. For the first time in 3 long years, she was finally back. Each brick of the wall ahead of her seemed strong and eternal, having stood there for a century already. It didn't make sense how 100 years of protecting could leave this barrier looking as invincible as it did. The coachman beside her snorted awake, for the 3rd time that hour. Darman had been driving 15 hours a day for 3 days straight, covering the 200 miles between Glassland and Arvendone without fail. He was a patient old man, a little round in the face and belly, and a head shorter than Gwyn. He had been kind enough to let her sit up front with him for the duration of the trip, giving Evander all the room he needed to prepare in the back. Of course, if anyone knew anything about Evander, that usually meant make up all the sleep he had missed the previous night. "Enjoying the view, Miss Gwyneth?" Darman asked through a yawn. Gwyn nodded, grinning at the old man. "This wall hasn't changed a bit since I last saw it." Darman chuckled, forcing back another yawn. "I don't think it ever will." They stopped in front of a large iron gate, where 6 guards stood at attention. Each soldier's armor was illuminated by torches above their heads, glinting off of the sharp edges of the halberds in their hands. The soldier closest to the carriage came up to them, his eyes shadowed by the rim of his helmet. The details on the front of the metal were expertly crafted. The helm of the armor bore the crest of the kingdom, 4 crescent shapes overlapping each other. "State your business," he said to Darman. "I'm here with Lord Arvendone Tadel and his sister, Miss Gwyneth Tadel. We are on our way to the castle." The soldier pulled a small scroll from his bag. "You're early. You weren't supposed to arrive until tomorrow." "We were a little ahead of schedule," Gwyn offered. "I'm sure the king won't mind having a few extra hours with the most prestigious doctor in all of Loranir." She often tried to speak of her brother in the highest regard, as he deserved. Evander was a genius. He had created medicines for many illnesses previously thought incurable. His knowledge of human anatomy was expansive, so much so that he could often tell what was wrong with someone with a single examination. He had yet to be proven wrong about anything. But the mind, that was where he excelled. Evander understood people as a whole. In just one sitting with him, he could get much information about the ails of one's thoughts and inner being. He understood the roots of anxieties, depressions, and even insanity. That was why they were even going to Arvendone. Well, why he was going to Arvendone. Gwyn was just lucky to be able to tag along this time. But Prince Cedric had some strange breed of anxiety that had started up randomly and suddenly, without warning or build-up, and Evander was finally called upon to research him and do all he could to help the prince. "We sent a messenger ahead yesterday to inform the castle that we were coming," Darman said. "I see. You are Miss Gwyneth, then?" the soldier asked, his face stretching into a disappointed frown. "I am." "Why aren't you in the carriage with your brother? The front seems to be no place for the daughter of a lord." Gwyn flushed, but sat straighter, looking into the shadowed mass where the soldier's eyes should have been. "You don't get to decide what is ladylike and what isn't. For your information." She felt a gentle, rough palm on her arm. "Miss Gwyneth, it's all right," Darman said, Then, turning to face the soldier, "This lovely young lady offered to sit up front with me in case I fell asleep. It's been a long week, but we were set on reaching the town this evening. She has been very patient with me for this trip, so I think that she can sit wherever she pleases."
"Whatever you say, old man. Just let me do a quick check of your carriage, and then you can enter the city."
The soldier shoved his scroll into a pouch at his waist, called over a couple of other soldiers, and began going through the bags and trunks, probably checking for hidden weapons or poisons or anything. Gwyn really didn't see how that was relevant. They were guests of the king. Maybe we shouldn't have tried to come early, she wondered, leaning back in her seat. "Miss," one of the soldiers said, stepping to where Gwyn was sitting. He was a different soldier than the one who had spoken earlier. "The doors to the carriage are locked. Could you please inform Lord Tadel that we need to search the compartment? He's not responding to us." "Oh, yes, of course, he's probably sleeping," Gwyn assured. She leaned over to Darman. "Do you have a key? Evander must have locked the carriage to keep his privacy, and my key is in my bag." "Which one?" Darman chuckled, handing over a small iron key. "One of them." Gwyn grinned back. She hopped from the driver's seat and slid the key into the lock. The curtains over the windows were drawn closed, giving no view into the body of the transport. Just how Evander liked it. Gwyn opened the door and stepped aside, for the other soldier to peer in. Evander was on the far side of the carriage, head leaning against the other window and glasses askew on the bridge of his nose. His blonde hair fell over his face, one lock caught in the corner of his open mouth. The soldier peered into the carriage, nodded curtly to Gwyn, and reported to the others. Gwyn pulled herself back up to sit next to Darman. The first guard shouted a couple of orders to the vigils above, and the gate in front of them began to open. Darman flicked the reins, and the horses started forward into the city. Gwyn wanted to see everything, but at the moment there wasn't much to see. A few flames flickered in the distance, outlining the shapes of houses and the lonely stragglers that wandered the night long after the workday was done. Everyone with an ounce of sense had gone off to bed. As the carriage carried further into the city, she noticed that the eyes of these drifters had locked onto the carriage. Their stares bore into Gwyn, making her feel suddenly vulnerable in the dark of the night. Darman seemed to notice Gwyn's discomfort. "We'll be at the city in a couple of minutes," he informed her. "Why don't you wake Lord Evander and help him look presentable for when we arrive?" Grateful for the excuse to leave, Gwyn hopped once more from Darman's side and joined her slumbering brother in the carriage. As soon as the door was closed again, she heard Darman click his tongue, followed by a slow rocking of the transport as it began to move again. "Evander!" Gwyn whispered, gently shaking her brother's shoulder. A snore was all she got in response. So she repeated his name, nudging him harder this time.
"How close are we?"
he mumbled, a yawn stretching across his pale lips as he closed his eyes tighter. "Darman says we'll be there soon. Do you need help getting fixed up?" Evander waved a dismissive hand, his fingers drooping limply. "It's fine. I'll just arrive he yawned again, "as I am." Gwyn raised an eyebrow. "Yes, I'm sure the king will be thrilled to have you treat his only son when you arrive with drool soaking your collar, eyes crusting, and looking pretty terrible altogether." Evander groaned, his body swaying as he sat upright. He removed his glasses and wiped his eyes, probably checking for the crusts Gwyn had accused him of. His long hair stood up on all ends, fraying away from the ribbon that held most of it back at the nape of his neck. "Ooh," Gwyn winced, amused. "We might have to pull over so you can change. Your hair is—" Before she had the chance to continue, Evander held up a thin finger, calling for her to stop.
Do you have a mirror?
No, she said. I only brought one, and it's in my trunk somewhere.
I need your help,
Evander said, suddenly alert, his sharp blue eyes almost to the point of pleading. Gwyn smiled nervously. Usually, when Evander asked for help, it had to do with something possibly dangerous and health-altering. Either that, or he was really lost. Why, in all of Loranir, would you want my help? She shot back. Because we are going to be there soon, and there is no way I'm going to greet the court looking the way I do now. It's dreadfully embarrassing, isn't it? Yes, quite dreadful indeed.
Gwyn!
Evander barked, running a hand through his disheveled hair.
This is serious. How would you feel if Cedric saw you looking as I do now?
Gwyn scoffed, her cheeks warming ever so slightly. When did the prince ever come into this? It's you everybody will be there to see. I don't actually have to be here.
You're right, I would have gladly left you behind, Evander prodded, smiling mockingly. Ah, but you begged and begged father to let you come. Why? Because you wanted to see. He clasped his pale hands together and fluttered his eyes derisively. Prince Cedric.
Oh, be quiet, Gwyn insisted, her cheeks getting warmer with every word that passed from her brother's mouth. Do you want my help or not? Evander's smile only grew, satisfied with Gwyn's flustered expression, as he spread his arms out, giving her the space she needed to work. Inching closer to her brother, she began tugging at the wrinkles in his shirt, fixing every wayward fold. Several places could not be helped, despite the force she used to rub them back into place. Gwyn wasn't sure if it was the cramped quarters of the carriage, or the fact that Evander was making this as difficult for her as possible, but by the time she determined that his clothes were acceptable, she could have sworn she looked in a worse state than her brother. All right, let me do your hair. Evander ran a hand through his messy hair, pushing the light strands of his tangled locks from his face.
It feels like it needs to be brushed first.
How perceptive of you. Too bad we don't have time, Gwyn said, forcefully turning him so that his back was facing her, or a brush for that matter. She fumbled with the strip of fabric tying his hair back at the nape of his neck. As soon as she freed it, Evander's hair fell and hung loosely just over his shoulders. After another minute of prying apart the masses of twists and knots, she smoothed his hair back and, straightening the ribbon, retied his hair into the small ponytail. A rapping came at the closed window at the head of the cart, and Gwyn moved to undo the clasp. When the window opened, Darman was peering in at them from the other side. I can see the castle walls, Niskin. She straightened, unable to resist the pull of her lips twitching into a smile. Evander leaned in his chair, pushing the curtains of his door's window aside, and strained his neck to see. Gwyn thought she could see a smile creeping onto her brother's face as well. Do you want to come and see, miss? Darman asked, noting the light in her eyes with a nod of his head. Gwyn's smile only widened. Darman tugged on the reins, calling out a gentle, easy. The coach slowed enough for Gwyn to maneuver herself out of the far door and up into the driver's seat. She sat down heavily, gathering the skirts of her dress around her legs. Look, Darman said, lifting his arm to gesture into the dark sky. And that's when she saw it. Flags and banners waving high in the evening wind, gardened vines reaching up, spanning the entire length of the mass of bricks. The wall was much shorter than the one surrounding the city, but nevertheless, it rose above her head like a giant wave, threatening to crash down on her. She drew in a sharp breath, a little surprised at the intimidation of the green and gold ornamented barricade. Just above the ridges of stone,
A single spire could be seen from the carriage. Gwyn thought she could even make out the little tiles of stone organized in overlapping spirals on the tall peak of the tower. But most of all, the flag, larger than any of the ones hanging from the wall, waved back and forth, displaying the kingdom's crest with pride and honor. The gold needlework shone in the moonlight, taking on a silver hue as the wind tore it around, unprotected by any walls or barriers. They stopped in front of the wall, argued more with the soldiers there, and were once again denied entry without a thorough search. This time, since Evander was actually awake, she could hear her brother sigh loudly as a knock came at his window, followed by his voice, now calm, whispering a single nonsensical phrase. "The dragon is slain and the people are free. Yet death hangs over all in the breeze. Even a hero cannot withstand a plague." The soldier hummed to himself before circling the carriage, calling off the search in his husky voice. Gwyn sat there, shocked at how quickly it was all over. She had expected this search to be much more exhaustive, but instead, with a few words uttered by her brother, there was no longer a need. The gate began to rise, and Darman flicked his reins, chuckling to himself. "I'd always heard His Majesty had a flair for the dramatic." "A password?" Gwyn asked, leaning forward in her seat as the horses pushed forward again. "If I'd known that Lord Tadel had been given a freeze from the king to get through the gate, I would have had you wake him up earlier." Gwyn smiled at the older man. "I would have preferred to have skipped out on that snobby guard at the front gate. Too late for that now, I guess?" "Too late indeed, Miss Gwyneth." Gwyn opened her mouth to say more, but her breath caught in her chest as her head swung around, her eyes drinking in every sight. The glistening windows reflected the large torches, waving like flags of light and heat. Her heart ached to see more of the magnificent light-wreathed Goliath before her, reaching higher and higher and higher, until the topmost flags seemed to be a constellation in the network of stars themselves. Arvendone Castle. Gwyn's mouth hung ajar as her eyes shot from one tower to another. How had she not seen this above the wall before? Had she been so preoccupied with Evander that the idea of viewing the tower's peak over the center wall completely slipped her mind? Spiraling rows and rows of glass, orange light bleeding through them, ran up each tower. A giant stained glass window graced the center structure, peaks and distant statues, too far and high for one to make out clearly. It adorned the palace perfectly, putting the unnecessary but at the same time most important touch on the castle before her. Gwyn had often recalled the sight of the castle first coming into view those many years before, but the image had faded and blurred, leaving behind a fuzzy, crude interpretation of the spectacle that it was. Her heart swelled at the thought of roaming through the magnificent halls, of being on the other side of those tinted windows, of seeing through the greens and blues and oranges, and looking out at the town from such a height that the whole of Selarin would be displayed before her. The carriage pulled to a gentle stop before the main doors. Another line of soldiers stood waiting, swords at their hips and halberds in hand. They were the very definition of firm. All of the armor was uniform, and not one of the men looked like they could be pushed down. They would have appeared to be statues if not for the fact that they had all turned at once, a single shout rising up from the two ends of the line. The staffs of their halberds slammed down on the stones. One of the soldiers left the line and stopped in front of the carriage. "Welcome to Arvendone, Lady Gwyneth Tadel." A footman appeared out of nowhere and opened Evander's door. He bowed low as the doctor leaned out of his seat and stood tall, drinking in the night air with a small smile. The footman, in turn, hurried to the other side of the carriage and held his hand towards Gwyn, his head dipped low.
Gwyn grinned at the young man as he helped her from her seat, impressed at the difference of courtesy inside the walls. She smoothed her skirts, and the footman hurried away. The soldier that had approached them stood waiting until Evander joined her side. The soldier dropped into another bow, saying, "Lord Evander Tadel, it is an honor to have you in Arvendone." He rose again, and Gwyn got the chance to study him. He was older than any of the other soldiers that had helped him. She could see wisdom and experience in his black eyes framed by small wrinkles in his dark skin. He had a kind but worn look about him, like he had been through too many fights and dealt with too much responsibility in his life. His armor was different from that of the other soldiers. It was ornamented distinctly with more intricate needlework on the green and gold split robe under his chest plate. His helmet had gold-leafed lining on the ridges, and his armor had the Selarinian crest displayed across his chest in the same gold coverage. Gwyn liked him right away.
"I am Runin Vaden, the captain of the guard. If you will follow me, the king is waiting inside."
Gwyn's heart skipped a beat. He was waiting? She grinned back at Darman, who sat still, reins limp in his relaxed hands. He returned the smile, along with a wave as the captain led them towards the grand doors. It took all she had not to run to the doors and instead remain beside her brother, keeping an air of ladylike pristinity. Her heels clacked on the stones under the layers of skirts, and her head bobbed and swayed in time with each step. The doors got ever nearer. They were barely 10 paces from them before they began to slowly ease open. Light poured. Silence rang. Air stilled. Gwyn nodded, a little surprised at the strange comment, but smiled back to him in return and nodded. He turned from her and began walking in a different way, and as he did, Gwyn thought she saw something change in his appearance. He looked more worn down, more tired and burdened, like the weight of a kingdom was almost enough to make him crumble. He was exhausted. In all honesty, that was the encounter she least expected to have with the monarch. It wasn't unpleasant, but instead strange. She couldn't put her finger on it. Perhaps it was just that the man seemed so authentic. She felt bad for him, as well. He had displayed such an air of contentment when talking to her. He probably hadn't meant for her to see the way his shoulders sunk. But in seeing that, Gwyn couldn't help feeling anything but respect for the man who governed the massive kingdom. Gwyn paced down the halls. Though her memory was a little rusty, she had spent much of her time memorizing the layout of the castle 3 years prior. She felt confident as she walked, not forgetting to stop every now and then and admire every detail she could. Every wall hanging and every statue, every set of decorative armor playing at guarding the paths, every stitch of embroidery, and most importantly, every painting. As a self-proclaimed artist herself, one of her favorite things, besides making her own art, was gazing at that of others. She was far beneath any of their levels, and was foolish to dream that perhaps she could ever leave her brother's shadow and present her own art to the lords, and possibly the king, to hang in their divine walls. It was a sweet dream, though an unfounded one. She had yet to do anything but charcoal drawings in a blank book. After a few minutes of wandering around, she spotted the familiar archway leading outside. A faint pillar of moonlight spread into the hall, beckoning towards Gwyn. Was she really ready for this? This was what she was here for, right? Cedric was in there. Cedric, the boy she hadn't seen in 3 years.
the awkward, gangly boy who hadn't had many real friends. Sounds from the courtyard caught Gwyn's attention, and she stopped, listening, enjoying the sounds of a spar, sounds of metal on metal, laughter, more swords clashing and the speaking within. Silence for a moment. Muttered words. More silence. Silence. A scream.